Hello students, welcome to the massive open online course of UGC on Indian economy. Before going to start the discussion, let me explain how my lecture will be organized. First, I will explain the background of the issue, why this issue at all is important for you to know about while you are studying Indian economy. Then I will very briefly explain World Trade Organization, how it is originated, what are its major function, how is about its organizational structure, and then what are its major important rules that is related with Indian economic policy. Then I will consider the India's role as a member of the WTO. It is the role of compliance and non-compliance with WTO rules. And then finally, in the conclusion, I will show you that under what conditions, that is India and also the WTO's functionality are at stake because of that belligerent intervention by the developed countries, and then how the WTO's activities can be improved, that can be used to protect the interest of the developing countries. Post-independence Indian economic history, the year 1991 has been considered as the benchmark year. Why? Because between that is prior to 91 and during the 90s, after that 91, so there has been a distinct phase-wise the differences in terms of the macroeconomic principles. Phase 1 that started from the inception of Indian economic planning, that is 5-year plan since 50s, and it continued till 80s, where the pro-socialist approach to the Indian economic planning was taken. Pro-socialist in the sense that public sector was taken all the control, and the private sector consumption, investment, production, this was regulated and controlled by the public sector economy. So far so good, external economic policy is concerned. It is that there was a restriction on the imported goods, there was restriction on the foreign investment, and also restriction in the foreign exchange market, dealing with the foreign exchange. In contrast with phase 1, during phase 2, we started from 1990s onward. So you will find that India had taken a series of dives into the market-driven liberalized system by dismantling all its trade restrictions, tariff and non-tariff restrictions, also the trade protections in terms of export subsidy. It has opened the door to the multinational companies for foreign direct and foreign portfolio investment. It has also moved towards the market-determined foreign exchange rate by replacing that Foreign Exchange Regulation Act by the Foreign Exchange Management Act. Actually, you know that in the very beginning, that means in 50s and 60s, that pro-socialist principle had resulted some success in Indian economy in respect of the growth in GDP, growth rate of GDP, compared to that happened during the pre-independence period. But in the later part that started since 70s, Indian economy had been exhibiting that low productivity, low rate of return on investment, and so far so good indeed India's foreign economic policies are concerned, then you will find that in late 80s, India was having a severe balance of payment crisis, that there was a large deficit in balance of payments, and to finance that deficit, India had to borrow from abroad, from IMF, and to meet that deficit, for the repayment, the India's foreign exchange reserve had been continuously declining. And during the late 80s, when there was a Gulf War, so during that Gulf War crisis, India had to just use the foreign currency in such a way that it's the reserve of the foreign currency, that depletion level that got down to an extent that India had not even sufficient foreign exchange reserve to meet the expenditure on the essential imports. There was also in the domestic frontier, there was a huge fiscal deficit. That fiscal deficit that occurred because of that government India's that non-developmental expenditure, and to meet that deficit again, India government had to take the borrowing from the internal and external sources, and all these had led to the large inflation. And Indian economists, the policymakers thought that to overcome that crisis, India should move towards the liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And they thought that if the competitiveness of the Indian producers can thereby increase, if they can face the legal competition from the global market, then that would boost up their incentive to increase their productivity, efficiency. This was the basic idea. In the whole transformation process, actually the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and India's membership in the WTO, India's participation as an active member in WTO, that had played a pivotal role. That's why we will consider the WTO as an important issue for Indian economy. Now come to the issue of the World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization is a multilateral trade organization which was originated from GATT. GATT is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was established in 1947 and started working in 1948 by an agreement of 23 nations. And the principal objective of that GATT was to liberalize the international trade. Then that GATT was actually not having any legal identity. That GATT was transformed into its eighth Uruguay round, and in 1994 into the WTO, and the WTO as a legal entity that emerged in 1995. The WTO emerged by the Marrakesh Agreement, and this WTO had a legal institution, and its major functions was to frame up the trade rules. That WTO was formed by 123 member nations, and at present there are 164 member nations and 25 observer nations. Their major functions, as I am telling you, that it is to frame up the trade rules that would have to be followed by all the member nations. It also acts as a forum of negotiation. It also acts as a body for the dispute settlement. If the dispute on trade agreement arises, if any member nation thinks that any particular country or member nation or a group of member nation is not following that rules, then they can raise the complaint against that, and then the dispute settlement body resolves that. And finally, it also helps the producers and also the exporters, importers in a member nation to smooth so that they can smoothly do their business in the world trade frontier. At the very top, there is a ministerial conference which usually meets at least every 2 years, and under that ministerial conference there are three bodies: dispute settlement body, general council, and also trade policy review body. Dispute settlement body is entrusted with settling the dispute among the member nations. The trade policy review body regularly for member nations that publish the trade policy review report, and the general council works under three sub-councils: goods council, Intellectual Property Council, and Service Council. All these councils are their functions are to oversee the functioning of the member nations on the agreements in three different areas of agreement, that is agreement on trade in goods, agreement on trade in services, and agreement on trade in intellectual property rights. Whatever they are doing, the WTO's basic principle is the principle of liberalizing the foreign trade, and for that they think that the major instrument to do that is that it is the reduction of tariff. Tariff means the tax rate on the imported goods. So if the tariff can be reduced, then imports will be cheaper, and then the domestic producer will have to face more competition, and therefore they would have an incentive to produce more and to increase the efficiency. This was the basic idea behind that. In WTO terminology, there are three types of tariff: MFN tariff, most favored nations tariff. On the basis of that no member nations would be allowed to make any discrimination on the tariff rate between the member nations. Then they can do that if there is under preferential trade agreement, so that they can lower the tariff. Then this is called the preferential tariff. And third tariff is the bound tariff. Bound tariff means that there only that maximum, that is the upper limit of the tariff will be set by the agreement. Now, then consider some important agreements under WTO. I will consider very selectively, particularly this agreement, that is the Agreement on Agriculture, which is very much pertinent. And surrounding this agreement, there has been a hue and cry, and also lots of controversy at present is arising, and which is related with the India's recent macroeconomic policy, particularly the foreign economic policy also. So that's why I have selected this agreement to discuss to some extent in details. The Agreement on Agriculture that contains some binding commitments on the trade in agricultural products with respect to three principles: market access principle, export subsidy principle, and domestic support principle. So for the market access principle is concerned, in that case it has been decided that the agricultural product would be traded only, and for that trade, that market access would only be governed by the tariff principle. And other than tariff principles, there won't be any other principles. The second principle is that related with the reduction in subsidy. As WTO always favors for the liberalization of the trade, then they think that if that export subsidy can be reduced, then the market distortion would be declining. And for that, they have actually considered the different target rate they have set for reduction. One is that this is for developed countries. They have decided to reduce the tariff by 36% below that which is determined at a constant price of 1986-90, and 21% reduction in volume for developed countries over a period of 6 years. And that would be for the developing countries 24% on value and 14% on volume for developing countries over the 10 years. So now consider the domestic support measures. Domestic support means that is to protect the agricultural farmers. India and many other developing countries, those are the agro-based economy, to sustain the livelihood of the agricultural farmers, they give different types of subsidy. Input subsidy means for subsidies on fertilizer, subsidies in the form of that credit or loan at a subsidized rate of interest, like that. And in that case, by the WTO agreement, it has been decided that subsidies would have to be reduced if that subsidies lead to the market distortion. And then they have distinguished between three different various types of subsidy boxes, and the subsidy boxes in the WTO terminology have been named in terms of the color related to the traffic signal. For example, the green box subsidies are those subsidies which are which according to their idea, they think that this is not distorting the trade, therefore there should not be any limit. Blue box subsidies, where they think that it is distorting the trade, therefore there must be limit in terms of delimiting production by setting the quota. And the amber box subsidies are those products have been enlisted under that box, where that they think that they are distorting the trade, therefore the reduction in subsidies are mandatory. Also, there are other types of important agreements, that agreements on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. This agreement was very much important during that COVID or pandemic period, because to just control the trade. And you know that that time almost all of the nations, they have closed their border for trade, and in that case, that agreement played a very vital role. So they set certain standards necessary to protect the life of the animals, human beings, while they are just they are engaged in trading. If the hazard arises, the health as a hazard or the life hazard, then there must be some necessary standards that would have to be maintained by this agreement. Then also another important agreement is related with the trade in services, and they have distinguished between different kinds of services. The telephone calls, international telephone call is one category of service. Tourism, where that service from one nation is using the service of the another nation, then that is also another category of service. Then third category of service that can be exemplified by the service of the foreign banking. Fourth category of services, where any foreign country can send their engineers for on-site work in any other country. So for all this, by this agreement, that WTO has given the access to the service personnel to move across the nations without any discrimination. So consider the dispute settlement mechanism of WTO. If any dispute occurs between the member nations, WTO's dispute settlement body, they can go through three possible stages of dispute resolution. First one is the stage of consultation. If any dispute occurs, and they first try to resolve it on the bilateral basis of consultation. If that can be solved within 60 days, then it is fine. And if it cannot be solved, then the WTO Secretariat forms a panel of 3 persons. They just give a report and with some recommendations. With that recommendations, the member nations are satisfied, then that is fine. And if they are not satisfied, then the third stage of dispute resolution mechanism starts working with appellate body of 7 persons. And that 7 persons appellate body, they finally take the ruling. That is, they decide whether they would revise the panel report or they will keep it intact. And in that way, the dispute is resolved. And so far, so good. Since 1995, the dispute settlement system has received 586 more than 586 complaints, and they have issued more than 350 rulings. India is being one of the member nations. India is the founder member of GATT and also the founder member of WTO. India is trying to go with hand in hand with WTO rules. In most of the cases, it is just trying to implement the rules and going in consonance with the WTO rules. And accordingly, India has just liberalized the Indian foreign investment policy. And let me check how much they have been in consonance with that. So there is the associate WTO agreement is the TRIMS. TRIMS is the Trade-Related Investment Measures Agreement, and according to this agreement, no member nations will be allowed to take any product-specific or quantity-specific discriminatory measure against any foreign investment. And India is trying to follow this. There are although some exceptions. India is trying to follow this. If we consider the Indian policy on foreign trade, at present, India has allowed up to 100% FDI without the need for prior governmental approval in a list of products, agricultural activities, defense, broadcasting, etc. You will find in India there are 3 types of multinational companies who are engaged in foreign investment, foreign direct or foreign portfolio investment. There are 3 types of multinational companies working. The set of companies who are working in the service sector, the set of companies who are working in the manufacturing sector, sector and the group of companies who are working in trading. More interesting thing is that if we consider the top 10 areas of the foreign investment by the multinational companies, that service sector is the largest recipient of the foreign direct investment. And this is quite significant because, this sector has been the greatest contributor so far Indian GDP. If we consider the 2019-20, 55% of the India's GDP has been accounted by that service sector, and more than 70% of the India's GDP growth is contributed by the service sector. So while liberalizing its foreign sector economy, India has been also making some reforms, very significant reforms in its foreign exchange market and in foreign exchange regulation. Previously, in the pre-reform period, that is during phase 1, foreign exchange rate was principally determined by the Reserve Bank of India. RBI was that exclusively the RBI could determine this. And then to deal with the foreign exchange rate, that RBI authorized person or company only could deal with that foreign exchange. But this has been replaced in the post-reform period in phase 2, where the market-based exchange regime has been developed. India has removed the restrictions on drawal of the foreign exchange, particularly for the purpose of its current account transaction, that means in the export-import related transactions. Foreign investment policy of 1991, there has been an automatic approval of the foreign exchange, that is up to 51% approval has been given by India government for 34 industries which have been designated with high priorities. Consider the current account deficit, that if we consider the 2017-18, that current account deficit has accounted for 2% of GDP. And during that phase 2, there were some exceptions, particularly during 2011-20 and 2012-13, that current account deficit exceeded 4%. But other than that, there was almost, this is getting down. That's good. But if we consider the other issue of the inequality, although the income has increased, but the World Laboratory Report on Income Inequality, that has showed that along with the increase in GDP, with the increase in also the GDP growth rate, there has been increase in income inequality also during the post-reform period. That should also be taken into consideration, not only the growth in income, not only the growth in the GDP growth rate, but if we want to consider the inequality, then this must have a negative impact. Now consider the dispute settlement mechanism of WTO at present, WTO stand and India's role of non-compliance in many cases, from which there has been a lot of controversy that have been created in the present scenario. Recently, there has been a dramatic increase in trade and tariff wars among the member nations. There has been an upsurge in economic rivalry, the surge in protectionism, and also there has been a belligerent intervention from the developed countries. WTO is succumbing to continuous and the tremendous pressures from the developed nations, so the WTO is not in a position to protect the interest of the developing country. India has been voicing not only its own major political economic concern in WTO, but it is also taking a lead role on behalf of the developing countries to protect the interest of the developing countries. And in that way, there has been many cases where the India has been considered as the disputed nations. So India's activity has been criticized by the developed countries, and lots of hurdles have been created, so that sometimes that hurdles is also not only for India, also for WTO. So sometimes it is creating the deadlock for the future trade negotiations. As I told you previously, that in the agreement on agriculture, one of the very important pillars is the domestic support measures. In the domestic support measures, minimum support price measures, so the subsidies to the agricultural farmers, these are very important. And India being an agro-based economy, India always wants to maintain wants to sustain the livelihood of the agricultural farmers, also the poor people in general. India and also many other developing countries has its own food security program, and to do that, India has a strong objection on the formula that is provided in the WTO agreement, that formula of calculating the value of the minimum support price and calculating the value of agricultural subsidy. Why? Because base year's price that has been considered to make it the price, the value at a constant price. The base year considered is the 1986-88 in many cases, which is long back from the current year. So if that calculation is based on that, India and also many other countries, they think that then the minimum support price by the WTO agreement, as it is recommended by them, should be much lower, and then that won't serve the purpose. Cultural livelihood would be at stake. In 2015, in the ministerial meet in Nairobi, a large number of developing countries led by India, China, South Africa, Indonesia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, they have just made a proposal for a permanent solution for this public stockholding program for food security, but that could not be resolved because of the impasse created by the developed countries like USA in particular, and also the other European Unions, that is countries belonging to European Unions. In 2018-90, India has been questioned by the European Unions and USA, Japan, Canada, Brazil, and Paraguay for breaching the 10% subsidy limit of WTO for rice. India, in this regard, has invoked the peace clause 3 times during 2020, the year 2021, and 2022. The peace clause provision, which was adopted in Bali Ministerial Conference in 2013, it was used for protecting the developing countries' food procurement program against action from WTO members in case the subsidy ceilings are breached. You will find a series of failures of WTO. The WTO could not reach an agreement on consensus because of the impasse created by the developed nations. So there are a series of examples given in 1999, 2001, 2003, 2013, 15, and also latest in during 2019, where the developed countries are creating impasse so that any consensus agreement cannot be resolved, and sometimes it is creating the deadlock in the operation of the WTO. And till now also that because of that impasse, India could not resolve the problem of the public stock holding. India could not resolve many other problems which is very much pertinent with its economic policies. And then how far that membership in WTO is beneficial for India in present scenario, this is a point of criticism. There have been some directives given by the economists, policy makers, on revival of WTO so that WTO can serve the purpose of the developing countries, serve the interest of the developing countries. And one of such directive that goes along with the Sustainable Development Goals. And this concept is reigning the world at present, and almost all of the nations in the world, they have accepted it. So that directive goes in the way that negotiations can be linked with the Sustainable Development Goals, if trade can be linked with the development issues of the developing countries and the less developed countries, as per the Sustainable Development Goals, which are accepted by almost all the nations, then there remains a potential of reaching a consensus agreement by the member nations in WTO, and WTO can survive.